The plan, first of all, is multi-pronged, it would seem, on the part of the GOP. And I'm leaving aside sort of trying to win the election based on ideas and getting out the vote. The real GOP plan, it seems they've alluded to it, even Trump has alluded to it, it's associated with a broader scheme to take the election and take power through the House of Representatives. I wonder if you can review with us how that might work legally. And then I will address the thing that will maybe even precede that, David, which is the disenfranchisement of voters, which has been very high profile, and SCOTUS has even ruled on that. But before I get to that, I wonder if you can talk to us about the bigger scheme in place.
Well, every state certifies the vote, and there are strict time limits by which they have to do that. And we normally haven't had problems in that regard. Even in 2020, the vote was certified, and then it was all ready to go, and slates were sent to Washington, D.C. of the electors. So if a state went for Trump, electors went there, pledged to Trump. And if it went to Biden, they went to Washington, D.C. What Trump had wanted the vice president to do in his only ministerial job was to really put his foot on the system and send it back to the states so they could send other electors, they could do other investigations. But actually, it proceeded fairly normally. I mean, until the coup tried to undo it, and that ultimately failed after 5 people were killed, and we had the marauding of the Capitol and people wanting to hang Mike Pence. Trump supporters wanted to hang Mike Pence, and Trump sending those incendiary messages even while it was going on and not tamping it down. But if you just look at what happened, they ended up voting in the House and the Senate just a few hours later. Of course, all of that drama, killings, marauding, but a few hours later. So it actually worked, Mark, the way it was supposed to work. So that's what happens. They certify the vote in each state, knowing which way each state went and knowing that they've certified the vote. That's when you start to see the tallies, knowing that those states are going to vote that way. That's when you used to see Walter Cronkite or somebody come on at 11 p.m. and say on national news, Reagan won. 49 states are going to Reagan, or Clinton beat Bush because so many states. We don't really have that now because they don't count the vote right away. They can't in some states by statute, and we have a lot of mail-in balloting now. But basically what they do is they certify the vote, and then each, because of the Electoral College, you can win a state by only a little bit and end up winning the entire state's electoral votes. That's one of the features or things that are wrong with the Electoral College for people who don't like it. The idea was that it helped minorities too in some states. It was said that it helped like Jews, for instance, because Jews were never going to be more than 2% of the country, but they could sway the vote in Illinois. And so there was a lot of back and forth that, there was actually some good things about the Electoral College in the sense, not that it gave more power to small states over big states, which it does a little, not nearly as bad as the Senate, but that it was good in that sense that some smaller group could end up having a real impact. You look at right now, for instance, the vote in Michigan, the Arab vote, Arab American vote in Michigan, they may swing the whole election. Yet there aren't that many of them numerically. If we just counted the entire vote of the United States, they would be a tiny fraction, right? But they may swing Michigan, and with Michigan may go the election. So they have an outsized influence, the Arab Americans in Michigan. I kind of got off of your question, Mark. Sorry.
No. Very good. You're sort of suggesting these are, you actually enhance the question and answer by suggesting that there'll be controversies around the vote. And you're also, I think, paying a very, very important bit of attention to the Electoral College and who would have an oversized say in the outcome. But back to the trail of the scheme to essentially undermine those results regardless of what they are. If you can create enough doubt, which has already been created. I mean, the seeds of doubt have been sown now for years, right? He still hasn't conceded the last election, and he said, I won't commit to accepting the results of this election, Trump has said. Tell me how then, with a lack of certification of a vote in one of these states, how that might feed the scheme to push things to the House of Representatives.
Right. Well, if you didn't certify the vote, let's say you had this Georgia board, which is full of Trump members, And it looks like the courts are not going to let them do that. But let's assume that they could just not report Georgia's results. Then Georgia wouldn't vote. If the vote starts to come in for Harris and this board that's pro-Trump finds a way not to count it, not to certify the vote, then Georgia wouldn't appear on that big board. It wouldn't be in the public's mind a state that it had voted for Harris. And that would, certainly play into the narrative that, well, there's fraud going on, there's problems, we wouldn't have a count. Trump would have so many votes, Harris would have so many votes, but nobody would have enough to win. And then during all that period of time after the vote next Tuesday, then all of these conspiracy rumors start to get, fomented and they get heightened. But, I just keep coming back to the thing that Trump is not in power right now. He was in power in 2020. That was really scary because he could push all the levers of power at the Department of Justice, for instance, the thing that the U.S. Supreme Court won't allow to come into evidence because it's supposedly covered by presidential immunity. But he had these huge levers of power then, so he could control things in a way that he doesn't now. If people run out in the streets and they start demonstrating and they all believe that from his propaganda that there's been fraud going on and there was fraud in the election on Tuesday and leading up to Tuesday, there'll be people running around demonstrating in the streets. If they break the law, the police will intervene. And if they don't break the law, they have every right in the world to protest, and then they go home in the evening. And it doesn't change anything in the way it did when Trump really had power.
But David, let me just then follow up on this. There are deadlines in place. This isn't just some kind of thing where you can go ahead and mess around and gum things up indefinitely. I think it's December 11th, and when I say I think, I'm sure of it. December 11th, there has to be certification of states voting. So you can't mess around indefinitely. You can go to court and you can contest various results in certification. And in conservative controlled states, there are courts, that is to say, the highest courts in a place like Arizona, for example, controlled by the GOP, that is to say, GOP-controlled court, they may rule favorably toward GOP protestations about the vote. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. Then once that would happen, how might that affect the deadline of December 11th for certification?
I think there's one other state that has a GOP majority on its state Supreme Court. So if you assume that those two courts won't do their duty, but they'll simply be flax for the Republicans and for Trump, which is not, I think, a fair. I think that is not a fair assumption, because you look at what happened in 2020, 60 out of 60 courts ruled against Trump, including judges appointed by Trump, ruled against Trump's motions. He lost all 60 motions on substantive grounds, the substantive motions, all 60 substantive motions were lost. So I think he'll probably lose in those two states, even with Republican dominated state Supreme Courts. But what would happen normally would be that if some board isn't certifying the results or doing things they're supposed to do, the Secretary of State would go to court and order that they be held in contempt. Or the Democratic Party would go to court and say we have standing and that this person has to comply with his or her duty, and they're not doing it, and they'd be ordered under contempt. And, the state officials may be on Trump's side and may want to put their finger on the scale a little bit for Trump, but they don't want to go to jail for Trump. We've seen that very few people really want to go to jail for Trump. Maybe Bannon and this other one for a couple of months. So they would do their duty. They do their duty because the court would say either that or contempt. And so they would do things. I think if things are a day or two late, some court would say you could do it a day or two late because there's been so much interference in that state. So I keep coming back to the thing. And even now, before the election, they've lost almost all the suits. Now, it's true, Mark, that the U.S. Supreme Court just ruled in favor of taking people who aren't citizens off the rolls. There was an issue that went to the U.S. Supreme Court just in the last day or two. And
Right.
The issue there was whether they could cull the voting rolls with people who were not citizens. They may have been green card holders. There may not have been like illegal aliens, this narrative that, Trump and Harris, Biden and Harris brought people into the country so they could vote. And there was nothing like that. But there are people in the course of time who end up on the rolls who only have green cards. They aren't citizens. And Virginia decided very much toward the end to cull those people off the voting rolls. The argument was, hey, it's too close to the election. There was the famous motor voter decisions, which said that you can't do those kinds of things within 90 days of the vote of November. And the Virginia governor started it just within 90 days, and he was obviously doing it within the 90 days. The argument was that he was violating that law, but the U.S. Supreme Court said 6-3. You'll never guess which 6 said that he could do it. You'll never guess which 3 said he couldn't do it under the law. They said that he could cull the rolls even within 90 days because if these people were not allowed to vote, they shouldn't be allowed to vote. But the problem is now somebody has to go run down and prove that they can vote between now and election day in just a few days. And so a lot of people who, let's say, should have been allowed to vote are going to get disenfranchised. That's the problem with these things at the last minute, is that the average person can't get himself or herself back enfranchised after they've been disenfranchised at the very last moment. A lot of these will be resolved, Mark, by them filing provisional ballots. If anybody out there hears this, don't be discouraged. Go to the polling place. If there's no other way that you think you can vote, or you hear something that there's a question about your vote, go to the polling place and file a provisional ballot. And that way, if things end up turning out that you should have been allowed to vote, your provisional vote should be counted. Some court should count your vote. And people may say, oh, my 1 or 2 votes. But again, well, how did Florida go in W? How many votes were there, Mark? Under 100, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on what recount you go with. But
recount, right.
Yeah.
One recount, it was like 100 or 500. It was some number like that.
I remembered 500, but it might have been fewer. I think there were 4, as I recall, independent recounts, though. And Gore won Florida. But
we know that now. They eventually, there's now no dispute how it was counted, and he won, and the Supreme Court stopped that. That was the famous, that Bush only won the election in one place, but in the one place that mattered. He won 5-4 on the U.S. Supreme Court, which was, and then they ruled that you can't ever cite that decision. So in all of these decisions that are being decided about election matters, Mark, the one case that you can't cite is Bush v. Gore, because it was deemed by the U.S. Supreme Court that decided it an anomaly.
That's
a farce.
What a perversion of the system. So then just to review where we are, there's this voter purge in Virginia. Again, the Supreme Court is saying it's okay. So this is all the, if you will, legitimate voting that's going on before Election Day, or it's being purged before Election Day. But the bigger scheme is that fighting certification, and you mentioned it's North Carolina and Arizona. Those are the 2 states where the high court is controlled by the GOP. But as David has just noted to all of us, just because they're controlled by the GOP doesn't mean that there's going to be a decision that will necessarily favor the GOP. But if you can, and I keep using the term throw sand into the gears, but, create issues around the vote sufficient that neither candidate gets to 270, it would then go to the House. That is correct, right, David Katz?
I'm sorry, Mark. You've been trying to get to that issue for a while. You're leading this horse to water. Okay, now
these diversions are all great. I love this is all information in all of them. So go ahead.
So yes, what would actually happen is that they would say that this can't be decided, or it needs to. We can't certify anybody the winner, the vice president. It's ironic because, it was Gore, and Bush v. Gore was the vice president, and he ended up having to count the votes against himself. This would be Kamala Harris sitting as vice president. But with the House and the Senate involved and everything else, there is a provision where if you can't decide it all, it goes to the House. And that is the one where the House votes just state by state. And so there are 27 or 28 states that are Republican. They're smaller. They're not California and New York, so they're much smaller in population. But since you count by states, the Republicans could deliver the election to Trump.
Just to be clear, you count by states, each state gets 1 vote, is the point.
Right, and so it would be 27 or 28 to 22 or 23, and Trump would win if it went to the House. But I really don't think it's going to come to that, Mark. But it could. And they could also pass some other procedure. It also gets complicated because a new Senate comes in there and a new House comes in there. And so normally what happens?
This is to that point. No Contendo saying, ask David Katz, if the vote goes to the House, could the 4 or so purple seat New York reps vote against Mike Johnson and help the Dems, assuming the Dems don't take the House? The Dems have to take the House for you to stave off the scenario that we've been talking about. Isn't that right, David?
Yes, if the Dems take the House, then they don't. I believe that they have the power not to allow it to be decided that way.
Exactly.
But if the Republicans take the House, they can allow it to be decided that way, and that could be by just a couple of votes. So they could win 2 of those House seats in New York. They could go Democratic, not change that the Republicans still have 1, 2, or 3 more members in the House. They would elect Johnson as the Speaker, and Johnson could do that. So if you care about who's going to be president, it actually matters who you vote for in the House. And I can just say this about the House races, the ones in New York. There was this real reaction to crime in New York, and these are basically the suburbs of New York. And they don't want to go into New York City and have to fight a lot of crime and have to deal with all those problems, hearing every day in the New York Post about someone who got assaulted on the subway. And clearly, I believe this happened in LA too. They exaggerated in these right-wing tabloids and right-wing TV how much crime there was in New York, just like they exaggerated how much crime there was in this Los Angeles area. But it stuck with a lot of the public, and it had a real impact on 4 or 5 seats going to the Republicans, which are very winnable, backable. They're very winnable, backable by the Democrats. And so the House may actually flip. There's also a lot of races down here in Southern California. I think there's Garcia who's being challenged, and there's a very strong challenge to him. He has these kind of ubiquitous radio ads that he was in the military. And there's a couple of other ones. I think there's Kim, I think that's her name. She's a Republican who's being very sharply challenged, trying to bring out people who care about a woman's right to choose. So the House has a really good chance of going Democratic, and people should not just vote for the top of the ticket, but go all the way down. And in my opinion, this is my editorial, should vote Democratic, because I think it's incredibly important for what happens to our democracy.
There is a question about what would happen. This is a Trump. Okay, this is one of those scenarios. I'm just going to ask the question. Here, Phineas asks, Mark, ask Katz, if Trump gets a prison sentence after the election, what happens? Does he serve his presidency in prison?
Well, that's meant to be funny, but this will not be the rule of law if he gets in. He will have his attorney general dismiss both federal cases against him, even the Mar-a-Lago case, which is so strong against him because he, took those documents, he kept them, he obstructed justice in not returning them. In my opinion, I think the evidence is overwhelming. And then, of course, there's the January 6th, all the things that we talked about. He's charged with doing those things criminally in the case in Washington, D.C. He'll have his attorney general dismiss those cases. He won't have to pardon himself. And as to the 2 state cases, he can't pardon himself. But I think, especially if he were president, I think there's really no chance that he would be sent to a prison or any kind of jail in the New York case. Even if he were, he would get bail pending appeal. And that would be if he were not the president of the United States. That Atlanta case, what a mess. And it's just very, very hard for me to imagine, after all my years in law, that case could really get to a conviction before a jury of Donald Trump while he was president and result in a prison sentence that the courts would affirm. So I don't think there's really any prospect, if he's reelected, if he's elected again, that he will go to prison or jail. He certainly won't go during his term of 4 years. He'll either have a stay or he'll have bail pending appeal during that period of time. So while they'd love that in the United Kingdom on the radio. Well, would he receive Macron at Rikers Island? Yes, with full diplomat. Yes, he'd have a state dinner at Rikers Island for Macron in 2025.
Oh, my God. It's an extraordinary thing. I know that we have sort of this obstructionist guy in Donald Trump. He's played the system. He's fought everything. He doesn't pay his people. He doesn't pay his contractors. He doesn't even pay his lawyers oftentimes. And he's just fought the system at every turn. And he's a huckster. He's a marketing guy. He's a pitch man. And for that reason, he's a different kind of political figure, and he's being held to a much lower standard, I would suggest, generally, than even we're holding his opponent, Kamala Harris. Is it true as well, David, that because he was president and may again be president, you made me think of this with your response to the last question, we kind of, he's had more of a play with the law than most people could ever get away with?
Oh, much more. They say that there's only two people who really get a fair trial in America. One is Donald Trump. Despite what he says, he's gotten the fairest trials in America. People have bent over backwards. You look at that judge in New York City, that in the Stormy Daniels, falsification of the records case. Anyone else would have been held in contempt. Anyone else would have been locked up. You would have walked into court that day where you better have a toothbrush because you were on your way into lockup if you were anyone but Trump. And of course, police officers get a really fair trial in America. You can go back to the Rodney King cops and all of that. There's been some comment here during the George Gascon Hochman rivalry, which, as you say, is not much of a rivalry because the polls are overwhelmingly in Hochman's favor. And, the $1 million donors like Soros didn't really show up with millions of dollars. And what did show up in this election cycle was enormous contributions, over $10 million more that Hochman has, so much of it from the police unions. And
this is for the DA race in Los Angeles, by the way. Yeah. That's what David's talking about.
Yeah, and as I said, I worked with Hochman in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and he's a capable, talented guy, and Lord knows he's a better speaker than Gascon. Right. Gascon, it just doesn't seem to be able to articulate his own positions, and now he's getting hammered that while he said he would prosecute more police officers, and he has prosecuted more police officers, I think one or none were prosecuted by his predecessor, that he hasn't won some of them. Well, I mean, yeah, that's the hard thing about prosecuting police officers, and people have a lot of sympathy for police officers like they don't toward normal criminal defendants. But my point is just this, just knowing that he would actively prosecute police officers if the facts and law were in favor of it, maybe Gascon deterred police officers from doing some things they might have done without that deterrence. We always talk about deterrence, and yet nobody gives Gascon the credit for maybe there was some deterrence. And the other thing I'd say is crime better go down in LA under this new DA, because he's promised that crime is going to go down. It's going to be so different. And the other thing I have to say is that the contributions are just, I just have to chuckle. And as I say, Hochman is very talented. I think he'll be a good DA. But I have to chuckle, like these huge contributions from Pete Wilson. Pete Wilson, the 187 guy, he's still around, our old governor. He's still a lobbyist. His law firm is giving thousands and thousands of dollars from the various lobbyists there to, not to Gascon. Yeah. Not to Gascon. And of course, all the lawyers, and I don't think it's going to make any difference. I think that Hochman will be very fair and objective about it. But all the lawyers are ponying up because he's going to be the next DA. So he's got over $10 million war chest.
Give me a few seconds on the developments in the Menendez brothers case and the decision by Gascon to, reopen look at that case from the standpoint of sentencing.
Well, Mark, I'm not taking Katz point for predicting that, because it was easier. It was easier than the ones I take credit for. But I did get that right, that Gascon was going to turn around within a week, and he was going to support the resentencing of the Menendez brothers, so that they wouldn't serve life without parole, Mark, but they would end up getting parole. They would end up getting released. Now, this one has become really fraught and interesting on so many levels. One is that it looks like the judge is not going to hold a hearing on November 29th as to whether they should get resentenced. It looks like he's going to push it into December. The important thing is that if Hochman wins and becomes the DA, he becomes DA in early December. So, and I think this makes a lot of sense for the judge. The judge is going to say, well, that's very nice that Gascon is okay with resentencing. Mr. Hochman, what would you like to do? And it's a difficult issue for Hochman, because a lot of his coalition, this real law and order coalition, to some extent, I would consider myself part of it, has a real question. Okay, I get it. Are you, first of all, are you agreeing with this position that they should be resentenced? And the resentencing, Mark, would normally end up with them being eligible for parole. That's what Gascon will agree to. recommend that they be eligible for parole, which means it goes in front of the state parole board. And if and when the parole board decides they should get parole, that can be overturned by the governor. The governor is Newsom. And I think if Harris does not win, and I sure hope she does, I think Newsom will be the candidate in 4 years. So Newsom's going to have to decide that route. So what they decided, the lawyers for the Menendez brothers, is they're trying to run to court before Hochman may become the district attorney and will have to take a position, because for now he's punted. He says he doesn't know the facts and the law well enough. I have to laugh because he knows the facts and the law well enough of all the rest of Gascon's case to say that Gascon didn't handle them properly. Gascon didn't know what he was doing. He knows the facts and the law of those cases inside the DA's office well enough to comment. But this one, he doesn't know well enough, the Menendez brothers, to comment on. And so he's going to have
so just to sort of summarize what you're saying, hey, look, this, first of all, was somewhat predictable, all of these moves, but now it goes to likely before a parole board. So their freedom isn't guaranteed. It's just that their rehearing in front of that parole board now is a guarantee.
Their lawyers, recognizing that is how it's about to play out, are trying to get a hearing before Hochman becomes the DA on that November date, and
Sure.
say that they should change the plea to the judge should find that it was involuntary manslaughter. The judge should reduce the charge. I don't see how any of that can possibly happen. I don't see what judge. I mean, if the judge wants to never run for office again, but I don't see why, not just politically, but I don't see legally why that makes any sense. They've been in jail for 34 years. Let's take a little bit of time and make sure that the system is doing this thing right. So I don't think the judge will allow the court to be stampeded, but they're hoping to have a hearing in November that somehow could actually get the brothers released. It is possible, Mark, that they could get bail, but that would be so extraordinary. There is if you think that someone shouldn't be in jail one more day and you want to stop that from happening, you can give someone bail, but I don't see the judge giving them bail either. Can we talk about one more thing if we have time?
Real quick. Let's do it real quick.
The latest Musk situation, which has a real legal dynamic. He was supposed to appear today in state court in Philadelphia. He did not appear. His lawyers appeared. What he did last night was he tried to remove that case brought by the Philadelphia DA against him to stop him from having that giveaway, that lottery, which he says is just having people show their love for the First and Second Amendment, but sure looks like indirectly something he couldn't do directly, which is paying people to go register. And that he ought to be enjoined and stopped from doing that. He made a motion yesterday to remove that case to federal court on the argument that federal issues predominate in it. The result of it was that now it's in front of a federal judge. Everybody wants to know who the federal judges are appointed by. It's a federal judge appointed by Obama who has the case. As of today, they're reporting that nothing has been set on the judge's docket today. The DA is asking that the case be sent back to state court, that actually state issues predominate. And so in the next day, I think by Friday, we're going to know, is it going to stay in a federal court or is it going to go back to state court where it started? And if it's back in front of state court, then that state judge is going to have to deal with two things. One, that Musk didn't show up. I don't think he's going to hold Musk in contempt. I don't think they can make anyone show up on 12 hours notice or 24 hours notice as they were trying to do. But Musk may actually be in court on Monday, and this matter may be decided on Monday. That's not much before the election. He's already given out $13 million, $1 million to 13 different people. And the argument by the DA is the same one you've heard from the commentators, that this sure sounds like it's illegal. Musk saying back, no, he's found this clever little loophole, basically, and he has the best lawyers. I mean, Musk has tremendous lawyers. They're fighting for him everywhere. So
what's your prediction on this one?
My prediction on this one is that they probably can't stop this program in time because Election Day is Tuesday.
It's already done.
I think that Musk and his lawyers were masterful in crafting this. And in setting it at just the right time. This may end up being the October surprise that people remember, but I still don't think it's going to work. Harris is ahead in the polls. She's doing better in Wisconsin. They just announced in the radio, I heard this as I was coming over, that she's up 2 points in Wisconsin. That's really good. When it was flat, and now she's up 2 points. And I think things are trending for her really well in the other states. So people should be optimistic, but they send your ballots in, go vote, and have all your friends come out and vote.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.